The mark on Sarah Durr's throat had never glowed before. Not once in 19 years. "Keep the veil up, girl." Matron Hesse had shoved her behind the stone column like something shameful that needed hiding. "The king notices nothing he isn't meant to notice." Sarah had kept the veil up, right until Guard Torrens' boot snagged the hem and the whole thing unraveled in one slow, catastrophic whisper of cloth. She was the only one not dressed in silk. The cursed Omega of Iron Ridge. The girl they fed through a slot in the cellar door, because handing her a plate meant touching her, and nobody touched her. 19 years, not once. The Alpha King of the North smelled wrong. Every Omega in the hall had whispered, cedar, dominion, warmth. He smelled like burnt ozone, cold pine, and old blood. Like something ancient that had been running without rest for far too long. He walked the tribute line without looking up, ignoring every perfumed wrist, in every tilted chin. Then he stopped. His pale gold eyes dropped, not to her face, to her neck, to the mark that was no longer black. The slot in the door opened at dawn and closed at dusk. That was Pac Alpha Silas's one mercy. He kept her fed. He said that often enough that Sarah suspected he'd started to believe it himself. She had lived in the cellar beneath the Iron Ridge Great Hall for 13 years. The walls sweated in winter. The floor smelled of damp earth, old grain, and something older than both. Something that had soaked into the stone so long it had become the stone. Sarah had stopped noticing it around age 12. You stop noticing the smell of a place when it becomes the only smell you've ever known. The mark on her throat had been there since birth. Pitch black, spreading from her collarbone upward like ink dropped into water, reaching toward her jaw as though it intended to swallow her face entirely. The midwife who delivered her had refused to touch her afterward. The pack healer called it the rot sign. Silas called it a liability, and Silas, above all things, did not tolerate liabilities inside his great hall. He never raised his voice at her, never raised his hand. He was cruel the way a locked door is cruel, not with violence, but with permanence. He had simply built a life for her that was indistinguishable from a sentence, then told the pack it was protection. We keep her fed. We keep her sheltered. What more does a cursed thing need? The other Omegas believed him. They had to. Believing him meant the cellar was Sarah's fault. And if it was Sarah's fault, it could never be theirs. She had memorized every footstep on the floorboards above. Hesse, heavy on the left heel. Torren, uneven, dragging. Silas, deliberate and slow, like a man who had never once been refused. Tonight the footsteps were different, heavier, more of them, moving with a kind of rigid, and whatever they weren't pack. The noise had been there for 3 years, 4 months, and 11 days. Jens knew the count the way you know the number of steps to your own front door. Not because he'd counted them, but because his body had memorized the weight of every single one. He'd stopped telling people about it around month 4, not because it got better. Because the way they looked at him when he described it, that careful, neutral physician face, was somehow worse than the noise itself. It wasn't pain. He almost wished it were pain. Pain had a location, a shape, an end you could aim yourself toward. The static had none of those things. It lived behind his eyes and beneath his back teeth and in the half-second between his thoughts. A high-frequency roar that climbed every time he used his alpha voice, and never, not once in 3 years, 4 months, and 11 days, came fully back down. His advisors called it battle fatigue. His physician called it a condition of command. His enemies said nothing at all. And if you knew anything about Jens Miller, you understood that silence from an enemy wasn't diplomacy. It was survival instinct. He rode into Iron Ridge at dusk with 40 soldiers at his back and the static sitting at the particular frequency that made his left eye twitch. The pack had lined the road with torches, organized, rehearsed. The desperate pageantry of people who owed more than they could pay and were hoping presentation covered the shortfall. Pack Alpha Silas stood at the gate with oiled hair and a welcome speech he'd clearly memorized. Jens noticed the hair first. The man had actually oiled his hair for this. He moved through the courtyard on instinct, through the noise, through the torchlight, through Silas's carefully constructed performance. The way a man walks through weather he has long since accepted will never change. And then, between one step and the next, the static stopped. Not softened, not shifted, stopped. Jens went absolutely still in the middle of the courtyard. 40 soldiers moved around him like water around a stone. He didn't care about any of them. The silence was coming from inside the great hall, from something or someone that Silas had very deliberately not mentioned. Sarah heard the boot before she felt it. That half second, the scrape of Torin's heel catching the hem of her veil, was the longest of her 19 years. Long enough to know exactly what was happening. Long enough to understand she couldn't stop it. Long enough to think, with the particular clarity that only arrives in the moment before catastrophe, I should have stayed in the cellar. The veil came loose in one slow, catastrophic exhale of cloth. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one Sarah knew. The cellar silence was empty. This one was full, packed tight with 40 held breaths, and the particular horror of people who believed, genuinely believed, that looking at her was something they could catch. She didn't move, didn't cover her throat. There was no point. Every eye in the Iron Ridge Great Hall had already found the mark, the black stain spreading up from her collarbone like ink through water, vivid and impossible to misread. Silas made a sound, not words, just a sound, the kind a man makes when he watches something he built very carefully collapse in under 3 seconds. She waited for the king's disgust. That was always what came next. It didn't come. Instead, footsteps, slow, deliberate, crossing the stone floor with the kind of weight that parted crowds without asking. Sarah kept her eyes down. She could see his boots stop directly in front of her. Black leather, iron buckled, close enough that she could have reached out and touched them. She didn't look up. You didn't look up at things that could end you. Then his hand came under her chin. Not rough, not the grab of a man taking something. The careful, almost bewildered touch of someone encountering a thing they had given up believing existed. He tilted her face upward, and for the first time in 19 years, someone looked directly at Sarah Durr's mark without flinching. His pale gold eyes were absolutely still. "How long?" Jens said quietly. "Have you been down here?" It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Just not directed at her. Silas laughed first. That was the thing Sarah would never forget. Before the protests, hadn't realized the king's expression hadn't changed. "Her," Silas said carefully, as though the word might correct itself if he gave it enough space. "My king, surely. There are other Omegas. Worthier tributes. The girl is... She isn't. She carries a mark that... I know what she carries. 3 words, quiet enough that the room had to silence itself to catch them. Jens hadn't looked away from Sarah once since tilting her face upward. He was looking at her the way men look at things they intend to keep. Not with hunger, but with the particular calm of someone who has already made a decision and is simply waiting for the room to catch up. Sarah understood, distantly, that her life was being rearranged. She just couldn't feel it yet. Jens reached into his coat. What he produced was a length of black silk ribbon. Narrow, clean, the kind of thing that had no business being on the person of a man who smelled like burnt ozone and old blood. He held it for a moment in his gauntleted hand, as if considering it. Then he stepped forward, and Sarah stopped breathing entirely. He tied it around her neck himself. Not over the mark, around it. The ribbon sat flush against the black stain on her throat, framing it. The way you frame something valuable. Something you want people to see rather than something you want hidden. His fingers moved with a careful, deliberate precision that suggested he was aware, acutely aware, of how many years it had been since anyone had touched her without flinching. He didn't flinch. When he stepped back, the static behind his eyes had quieted to something almost bearable. He didn't understand why yet. He didn't need to. She is my tribute, Jens said, addressing the room without looking at it. My only tribute. We leave at dawn. Silas opened his mouth. One look from Jens closed it again. The carriage smelled like leather and iron, and the particular silence of a man who had stopped making conversation somewhere around year 2 of a 3-year war. Sarah sat across from Jens Miller and tried to take up as little space as possible. Old habit, 19 years of practice. She had the posture of someone who had been told, repeatedly, and in various ways, that her existence was an inconvenience, and had eventually decided to make herself smaller rather than keep arguing with a closed door. Jens sat with his eyes shut and his jaw set, and his hands braced against his knees like a man riding out weather. The static. She didn't know what to call it yet, but she could see it on him the way you can see a headache on someone's face before they say a word. The slight tension around the eyes, the too controlled breathing, the specific stillness of a person holding something together through sheer will. The carriage hit a rut in the road. Sarah's hand shot out for balance and landed on his forearm. She pulled back immediately. Reflex, apology already forming. He said, "Don't." Not a command. The word came out cracked at the edges, stripped of its authority, closer to a confession than an order. His eyes were still closed. The tension around them was gone. Sarah didn't move. She sat with her fingers resting lightly against his forearm and watched something she had no language for move across the face of the Alpha King of the North. The locked jaw loosened. The controlled breathing deepened. Not the discipline of a man managing pain, but the involuntary release of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to put it down. His hands uncurled from his knees, one finger at a time. He looked, for just a moment, like someone who had been running for 3 years and had finally, accidentally, been allowed to stop. "What are you doing?" he said quietly. "Nothing," Sarah said, because she wasn't. She was just sitting there. That was apparently enough. Outside, Iron Ridge disappeared behind the tree line. Neither of them spoke again. Neither of them moved. The king's citadel was beautiful the way a blade is beautiful, designed entirely to cut. Years learning how to smile while meaning years, learning how to smile while meaning something else entirely. She had grown up with cruelty that wore a cellar door. This was cruelty that wore silk. They stared at her throat first. They always did. But these were not Iron Ridge Pack members stumbling backward from superstition. These were people who catalogued the ribbon around her neck, measured the distance between her and the king, and began calculating, all within the span of a single breath, exactly what her presence meant for their own position. Sarah had never been assessed before. She had only ever been dismissed. Somehow, this was worse. Duchess Ilara found her within the first 10 minutes. She appeared at Sarah's shoulder the way cold air appears. Without announcement, without sound, was simply suddenly present. She was extraordinary looking, the kind of woman who understood that beauty was a weapon and had spent considerable time sharpening it. Her eyes moved over Sarah the way a physician's eyes move over something they've already decided not to treat. "The ribbon is a charming touch," Ilara said pleasantly. "He used to tie them around hunting dogs he was particularly fond of." She walked away before Sarah could answer. Which was, Sarah suspected, entirely the point. Or she was fluent in isolation, had 19 years of experience. She was fluent in isolation, had 19 years of practice. But the cellar had been honest about what it was. This place wrapped its hostility in crystal glasses and appropriate footwear, and somehow that made it sharper. By nightfall, 3 ladies-in-waiting had warned her, each in their own carefully worded way, to be careful. Not of the court, of Ilara specifically. Sarah stood alone at the window of the room she'd been given, an actual room with an actual bed, which she couldn't bring herself to trust yet, and watched torchlight move across the citadel walls. Somewhere in this building, Ilara was already planning something. The ribbon at Sarah's throat felt suddenly very thin. She heard it before she saw it, a sound like the air itself cracking. Low, pressurized, the kind of frequency that bypassed the ears entirely and went straight to the base of the spine. Every instinct Sarah had said the same thing simultaneously. Leave. Now. Fast. She had spent 19 years listening to those instincts. They had kept her small and safe and completely alone. She walked toward it instead. The corridor outside Jens's chamber had emptied the way corridors empty when something genuinely dangerous announces itself, completely and without dignity. 2 guards, 3 attendants. 1 physician who had clearly decided that his oath had geographical limits. All of them moving away from the door with the particular speed of people who would later describe their departure as a strategic withdrawal. Sarah stopped in front of the door and put her hand on it. Inside, something heavy hit the wall. Then silence. Then the low, pressurized sound again. Closer now, and worse. The sound of a mind that had been holding itself together through sheer force of will finally losing the argument. She opened the door. Jens was on his knees in the center of the room. That was the thing she was not prepared for. Not the overturned furniture, not the cracked stone where his fist had apparently met the wall, but him on his knees. The most feared man in the North, reduced to the floor by something no one else could see, or fight, or reason with. Does enter. His head came up, and his eyes were enter. His head came up, and his eyes were wrong. Pale gold swallowed almost entirely by black, the alpha rising to the surface the way it does when the man underneath can no longer hold the wheel. "Get out," he said. The words came out fractured, a command with no authority left in it. Sarah crossed the room and sat down on the floor directly in front of him. Not behind him, not beside him, in front, where he could see her, where he had to see her. She placed her hand over his. The sound stopped. Every guard who had fled that corridor would spend years trying to explain what they had abandoned her to face. None of them ever found the right words. The decree arrived at dawn. Oh, written on council parchment in the particular careful language that powerful people use when they want to do something unforgivable and need it to look procedural. Sarah read it once. Then she set it down on the table because her hands had started shaking, and she refused to let parchment do that to her. The sacred fire, an ancient rite of purification, which was, if you removed the ceremony and the scripture and the centuries of institutional credibility built around it, simply a fire. A one that the innocent supposedly survived and the corrupted did not. The council had been using it for 400 years to remove people they found inconvenient. They had developed, over those 4 centuries, a remarkable ability to determine in advance which category a person fell into. Sarah already knew which category they had chosen for her. She heard Jens before she saw him. Not the static. His boots. That deliberate, unhurried stride she had memorized through a cellar floor. Moving through the corridor toward her room with a speed that suggested someone had delivered the news to him approximately 30 seconds ago, and he had not stopped moving since. He read the decree standing up. Once. His expression didn't change, which Sarah had learned by now was not the same as nothing changing. It was the face of a man rearranging something very large and very dangerous behind his eyes. "You're not touching it," she said. He looked up. The sacred fire. Whatever you're thinking, the war, the council, all of it. She stopped, started again. "I am not worth the kingdom." Jens set the parchment down with the careful precision of a man setting down something he intended to pick back up as a weapon. "I didn't ask your opinion," he said quietly, "on what you're worth." He left the room before she could answer. She heard him summon his general in the corridor. Heard the general's sharp intake of breath. Heard Jens's voice deliver 3 sentences in the flat, unambiguous tone of someone who had already decided the argument was over. The council had built their case on 400 years of precedent. Jens was apparently prepared to burn all 400 years to the ground. The high priest made one critical mistake. He announced the execution at dawn in the throne room, with the full council assembled and 40 witnesses in silk and furs, because he wanted an audience. He wanted the court to watch the cursed Omega burn and understand, permanently and collectively, that the king's attachment to her had limits that divine law could enforce. He had forgotten, in his considerable confidence, to account for what she had spent 19 years learning. Sarah had grown up with nothing but silence, shadow, and the sound of footsteps that told her everything about the person making them. She knew, by the time the guards reached her door, that something was wrong, not from what she heard, but from what she didn't. Jens's footsteps were nowhere in the corridor. His generals were, moving fast, moving purposeful, moving like a man executing instructions that had been issued hours before dawn by someone who had not slept and had not intended to. He had known. He had known, and he had already moved. The throne room doors opened onto chaos that had been choreographed. 3 council members restrained before they reached their seats. Elara standing alone at the far wall with the specific stillness of a woman recalculating everything simultaneously. The high priest at the center of the room, his 400-year certainty evaporating in real time as Jens Müller descended the throne steps, and the static, for the first time in 3 years, 4 months, and 22 days, did not rise to meet him. Because Sarah was standing beside him. She had not planned to speak. She had no rank, no title, no precedent behind her. She had nothing except 19 years of being told what she was, and the sudden clarifying certainty that she was done agreeing. "I am not a curse," she said. Her voice carried. It surprised her. "I am the grounder, and this kingdom's king stands because of what you tried to bury in a cellar." The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. They crowned her that evening with obsidian, black as the mark on her throat. Never came back. It never came back. If never came back, it never came back. If Sarah's story stayed with you, you already know why. Drop one word in the comments below. Just one. I read every single one. And if you need to know what happens next, hit subscribe. This story isn't finished yet. My name is Pauline, and I'll see you in the next one.